Hello, everyone, and welcome to the live exclusive launch of Magical Tales from French Camelot. And we are delighted to have Sophie Masson, the author of this amazing book, and the wonderful Lorena Carrington, who is the illustrator. And as you can see, look at our beautiful collection behind us. And there's a few that I think behind my head that I can't fit on the shelf. Our beautiful collection is growing and we're so proud of it. And so today I'm going to bring up Sophie to have a conversation about the book and Lorena, because it's very much a team effort between these two, and you're going to understand why this book is so magical, because the bond that they have is magical. So welcome Sophie and Lorena, and congratulations on the launch of Magical Tales of French Camelot.
Hello,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. And thank you for believing in the book and publishing it. It's just beautiful production too.
It is gorgeous, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
just so
Yeah.
beautiful and exquisite. And when I had it, I was like, oh, it's just beautiful and gorgeous, everything we hoped it to be. And it seems like a lifetime ago when we signed the agreement, because these books have to go on a journey and a process. And can we share a little bit about that process? And from you, Sophie, how do you select the stories, and then
Yeah.
when do you deliver them to Lorena?
Yes. So, yes, Lorena and I had worked, of course, on French fairy tales, and we had had a lovely time working together on it, and found that we clicked absolutely well. As sorry, found that we clicked really well as a creative team,
Yeah.
and so basically we're sort of thinking, oh, we'd like to do another project, and I came up with this idea because it's something that I'd wanted to do for ages, was to retell some of these French Arthurian stories. So people know a lot about the ones that have been made famous in the English language, and of course, King Arthur is originally a British legend. But it became incredibly important in France in the 12th century. And in fact, it's there that really it took off, as a global phenomenon, if you like, and came back to England. And they actually took on some of the French stuff that had been written. So it was like this. In the original British version, he was a war hero. He was a great leader, but in the French one, he had a court. There was all sorts of things going on, and so there was all the other characters that we've come to know and love. They really started in France rather than in England. But so I've been familiar with them for a very long time because I come from France originally, and it's part of the literary heritage of France. And so there's a lot of them, a lot of stories, and I just had to choose my favorites really, and my favorite authors, because the authors in the 12th century, they really sort of, a lot of things that we know from before, they're sort of anonymous. Like, we don't actually know who wrote Beowulf, for instance, but we
Yes.
do know who wrote these stories because they actually said, I am the author. So that they really had a sense of authorship. And also, they created this new genre, which now we would call fantasy, but that in France was called roman. A roman, which is translated sometimes in English as romance, but actually it also means novel in French. And it's still the word for a novel, roman. And then there's another sort of aspect which is called the lay, and the lay, which is Lai, is like a short story. It's called a lay in English, but it's actually a short story, often in verse. So they're kind of like verse short stories, if you like. So I decided I would choose two of my favorite authors in each of those things. So in the roman, or the novel, was Chrétien de Troyes, who was a very, very famous author, and who is probably one of the greatest authors of the Middle Ages in any country. And Marie de France, who is also a very wonderful writer, and she was a female writer too, and one who actually signed her stories. So that was also unusual for the time. And she appeared to have been quite a feisty lady in what she says in some of her introductions, that she was told off for writing stories that were not at all true. The usual kind of people who say, oh, fantasy, you can't read that. It's not real. So they were saying those sorts of things back in the 12th century. But she didn't care what they said, and she just wrote her things. And she had the patronage of kings and queens, which also pretty helpful for a writer. And Chrétien was the same. So Chrétien, the other thing that's really important to remember is that the 12th century in France was a time when women were really quite important in the cultural life of the country. So they were often patrons of the arts, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was a French queen before she was an English one, and Marie de Champagne, her daughter, who was actually the patron of Chrétien de Troyes. So it was believed that Marie de Champagne suggested the character of Lancelot to Chrétien because he was a new character. He didn't appear in any of the British things, and neither did Percival, by the way. So it's a fascinating background. That's just to give you some background. And so I decided to choose the stories that spoke to me most directly in whatever way that happened to be. Now, Chrétien's stories are very long. They're novels, basically. They are as long as novels. And so I obviously had to choose extracts from those. But with Marie's work, one of the stories I translated in its entirety, and the other two just bits from it, that I liked.
Yeah.
So what spoke to me in them was the characters that come out so strongly, because that's one of the real strong things in there. Unlike the literature of, say, before, I mean, Beowulf is a wonderful story, but Beowulf, the characters aren't as strong in their, they feel like great heroes and so on, but they don't necessarily have that full gamut of emotions, whereas the characters in the French Arthurian ones do. They don't always act well, and like, for instance, Guinevere doesn't always act well at all. But neither do Percival and Lancelot and a lot of the others. They get angry, they sort of stalk off, they do stupid things. They're very human, but there's also the magic, so it's really really good. And I mean, like, especially Chrétien had a great sense of humor. And so he does have some really funny elements in it, particularly in the story of Percival, because Percival is such a naive young guy and he just says any old thing. And so there's quite a lot of humor in his story, as well as some very touching bits. So I had chosen these stories, and Lorena and I were talking all the time. About them, and I just started sending them to her as I was writing them, so that she could sort of have an initial look and see what she might respond to most.
Yeah, I love it. I love how you make it happen. And I love how knowledgeable it is when you hear the backstory behind each of the stories and how it came together. And I will come back to you to talk about the genius of how you put these together, Sophie. But I just want to talk to Lorena at this point. Lorena, so these amazing stories are finding their way to you. And I know that because you've done many of these books behind me, and I know that you see you see a story, and what could be really, become alive with your beautiful photography. Can you talk a little bit about that process with Sophie's stories?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure anyone who's listening now has heard me sort of talk about how I make the illustrations. So it's all photography. I do montage work and put it all together in Photoshop. So I have to actually photograph everything. And with the previous book with Sophie, French Fairy Tales, I actually got the chance to go over to France and actually go to some of the places where Sophie had set the stories. So I was actually in the place where Sophie had written the stories around. So when I made the beast out of that story, I could actually gather sticks and leaves and twigs and stuff out of the grounds of the castle where the beast lived, physically in Sophie's story. Anyway, unfortunately this time I couldn't go back to France because of, certain events that have been.
We don't want to say the C word. Don't say the C word.
And Sophie was telling me about these incredibly specific locations where these stories, potentially actually originated from. I thought, oh, how wonderful it would be to actually go over there. So I had to make do with all of the other beautiful castles and landscapes I'd been to a few years before, but that was okay. At least I was still working with the landscape that the stories came from. the area. Before working on French fairy tales, I wouldn't call it just making do, because I live in a very beautiful place here in Victoria, and I built up all my illustrations from my local landscape, so from the garden and the bush and the places around here. So since going over to Europe, I've got an enormous bank of images that I can use now to illustrate these stories and ground them a little bit more in the places where they came from. That's an immense privilege to have been able to do that, and an immense pleasure as well, because every time I make a new illustration, I have to go back through all my lovely travel photos of beautiful places.
Brings you back there, doesn't it, Lorena? I'm sure. And I'm sure whenever you were there, like, you accumulated so many images when you were there. And the book, honestly, it's just as if you did go on a research trip. It's just so exquisite. How you bring these to life is just so phenomenal. It's just beautiful imagery. Like, how do you not run out of ideas? You just don't. You just keep developing and imagining more beautiful images for each story. It's phenomenal. Really.
Working with people like Sophie, who just, every time I read their stories, I got constant flashes of illustrations and images, and if I was illustrating everything I wanted to, there wouldn't be any room for the words. We didn't find them in the first place. Sophie has the most incredible ability to really just paint these, in words, obviously, this incredible imagery that just is inspiring for someone who's very visual. I tend to see everything I read anyway, but when I get to work with someone like Sophie and actually bring those images to the page, it's an immense pleasure. It's wonderful.
It is. It's not a chore. And I know those magic days when I feel Lorena's working on something, and then all of a sudden, ding! And you're going, oh, wow. It just takes your breath away. It really does. It's phenomenal. And Sophie, whenever you're pulling these stories together, knowing that, you're working with Lorena, that's bound to influence how you tell the story, and the genius of how you pull, you've chosen your stories and how you pull them together for your readers and make them your own is pretty phenomenal. I call it genius. So would you like to share with us a little bit about your writing process?
Yes, sure. So with these, it's very much a question of looking first, obviously, at the original text. So I looked at it first in the original Old French, and then in modern French, contemporary French, and then in an English translation, having a look at it all. But I worked from the original Old French and the modern French, and I didn't want to. I looked at things before I started in the English, but I thought, no, this is not how I want to handle it. And because I'm, native French speaker, I'm going to have a different rhythm to how it's said and all sorts of stuff like that. So I worked with the Old French and the contemporary French together. But sometimes in the contemporary French, I thought, looking at the Old French, which you can more or less read, not all together. It's a bit like trying to read Chaucer or something, but you can sort of, make it out. Not quite as difficult as reading Beowulf in the original, for instance. But so, but some things in the contemporary one, they sort of changed certain things. So I adapted a lot of stuff. I decided, okay, I'm going to put this in, and I'm not going to put that in. So there were bits that I thought, okay, these are the bits that I like in the state. For instance, the first story, which is the boy in the forest, the girl in the wasteland, and the Fisher King, which is basically the story of Percival, which is one of the most delightful stories in the Arthurian corpus. And so I thought, okay, I love it when you meet Percival first as a boy in the forest, who's been brought up by his mother away from society because she doesn't want him to become a knight, because her father and her husband and 2 sons have died in the service of the king as knights, and she wants to keep Percival safe. And then one day, he's in the forest and he's quite happy, doing his thing. Yeah. And he meets these knights in the forest. So, I mean, and it's, you know, he doesn't know who they are, and because his mother told him, you know, there's these devils sometimes in the forest, you know, and they make a loud noise and stuff, and so you think, oh, you know, I'm going to fight them. I'm big now. I can fight devils too. And so when he meets the knights, he's completely blown away. It's a really interesting scene. It's quite funny because he asks all sorts of naive questions. But I try to heighten some of those things. Chrétien has lovely images as well. So, so for instance, he says, it was that beautiful time of the year when all the trees are bursting into bloom and green flows over the fields and the meadows, the time when every morning the birds sing praises in their sweet version of Latin and all the world is filled with joy. Sort of, it's a beautiful image of a spring morning, and it immediately, across the centuries, you can hear this man's voice. It's just extraordinary, so close. And we can still see this, even though we're so far away from him in time and society and culture. So, I really wanted to reproduce that delightful tone. So I worked quite hard on the images, on the feel. It's quite light in feel, quite light-hearted a lot of the time. So I am very careful in choice of words and things like that. And yes, because I knew I was working with Lorena from the start, I was also thinking, okay, what could work here that would, that works visually. And I do have, and thank you, Lorena, for your lovely words about my writing. And I do see the scenes. I am quite visual in that sense. So I do see them very strongly. So all in all, it was just, paying homage to the original whilst having my own voice, which is now, of course, and also thinking of the illustrative potential at the same time. So, but because they are such visual stories in themselves, because, the way they were told at the time, a lot of people were illiterate, of course, they would be told these stories by the literate people, by the storytellers, by the bards, by, etc. So you had to paint a picture with your words as well. And so that's what I tried to do with each of them. And Marie de France in her story, she has quite a different voice to Chrétien. She can be more brisk, she really gets to the point. But I wanted to have that as well, that strong-minded sort of feel that you get in Marie. So when you're doing a retelling, you have a responsibility to the original teller of the tale as well as to your own work. So you just balance the two so that it doesn't sound quaint or, old-fashioned, but at the same time, it doesn't go against the actual cultural things that are within it. Yeah. I'm not sure if that explains it properly, but
it absolutely does, Sophie, absolutely. Yeah. And even like the scenarios, like of the mother trying to protect her son and taking them out and extracting them from what, would have, and like that kind of scenario, even though it was in the 12th century, it's still relatable,
Absolutely.
It's amazing. It's phenomenal. All right. Well, we share this amazing book with everyone so that we can get a sneaky peek inside. Were you going to read a part of a story, Sophie? And
sure, if you'd like, yes.
Look at the cover, guys! Isn't it beautiful, Lorena? What story is this image from?
That one is from. I'm going to be put on the spot and trying to think of the name of it. Sophie.
It's from the Fairy Queen, isn't it?
Fairy Queen. Thank you. Oh my goodness. So yes, it's from the Fairy. So yes, they're riding off into the sunset at that point.
Yes,
see the castle.
One of those unusual stories too.
Yeah, I think that's why it's my favorite. It is unusual, isn't it? It's really beautiful. What page are we going to, Sophie?
So I thought I might read a little bit about when Percival meets the knights in the forest, because that's a kind of funny bit. There's lots of other bits like touching and frightening and all sorts of things in the stories, but I thought this one reads well. It's funny because he keeps asking all these daft questions. So,
are we page 3?
So page 13.
13.
Page 13.
There we go.
So
Beautiful
remember,
image.
I was explaining that Percival had been kept away from the world, and his mother had told him that these people who might come through the forest and make a big noise, that they were devils and he must keep away from them. And he was thinking, no, I'm going to fight them. So here he is, he says, and then he comes to it and he sees them. And that's on that beautiful picture on the page there is where Percival first sees the knights and where he sees them sort of haloed in sunlight.
Yeah.
How magnificent those angels were, their bodies glittering in silver and gold, their faces sternly beautiful under shining helmets and green and red and blue on their pennants and their shields. Haloed by the sunlight filtering through the leaves, they sat tall and upright on horses, with trappings so glorious they must have been made in heaven itself. And the great noise they made as they moved through the forest now sounded to Percival like the sweetest music he'd ever heard. How fortunate I am to have been given this sight, he thought. How much I repent, poor sinner that I am, of having mistaken them for devils. Awestruck, he came out of hiding and threw himself on his knees, praying loudly both for forgiveness and in gratitude. At this sight, the angels stopped in great surprise, and their leader said to his men, "This boy seems to have lost his wits at the sight of us, and if we advance further towards him, he might even die of fear. Yet he's the only human thing we've seen in these woods, and we need an answer from him as to those we seek. So you stay here, and I will go towards him and see if he has at least some wit left to tell us what we need to know." So saying, the leader of the angels came towards Percival, calling out to him, "Young man, don't be afraid, don't be afraid." "Huh, afraid?" said Percival, still on his knees. "Oh no, by the Saviour, in whom I trust, I'm not afraid at all." He looked up, his eyes shining. "Are you God?" Startled, the leader gave a bark of laughter. "No, what? No, no, I am a knight, as are we all." "A knight?" Percival repeated wonderingly, looking from one to the other. "I have never heard of that, ever. Not one word have I ever heard, not ever cast eye on a knight. And yet here you are, handsomer than God." He sighed, looking down at his homemade shoes and homespun clothes. "Oh, if only I could be shining and well made as you all." Smiling at the youth's naivety, but eager to get on with his task, the first knight said, "Boy, we are looking for 5 knights and 3 young maidens. Have you seen them pass through these lands?" But Percival took no notice of the knight's question, for he was much too interested in other things. "Fair friend, whom I know now is a knight by name, tell me, what is this?" And he pointed to the knight's lance. The knight laughed and said, "Well, it seems I won't get an answer to my question till I answer yours. Well, I will tell you this. This is my lance." Percival held up his wooden spears. "Lancing? Throwing, that means. That's also what I do with these, just like your lance." "No, you fool," said the first knight. "Lances are not thrown. They are used to strike heavy blows." "Then I prefer my spears, especially this one," said Percival, proudly holding it up, "because when I throw it, I can hit whatever I choose, be it bird or beast, or even the most ferocious. Even when I'm far away, it's just as good as a crossbow bolt." "What do I care about such nonsense?" said the first knight, sighing. "Just tell me, did 5 knights and 3 young maidens pass this way?" But Percival still took no notice. Grasping the knight's shield, he said, "What about this? What's it called?" "Not again," said the knight. "Once again you ask me silly questions when you're supposed to be answering mine. Well, you are harmless enough, so I will tell you. It is called a shield." "And what does a shield do?" said Percival. "It is a right loyal friend to me," said the knight, "for it protects me from harm and from sudden blows when I am attacked, and has saved my life on many an occasion." And I'll just stop there, but you can read the rest of it. And he keeps asking questions, but eventually he tells them where the 5 knights and the 3 maidens have gone. And I just think it brings out Percival's youth, like he's only
Yeah.
about 16, and also his naivety because he's kept away from the world, but also his boldness. You know, he's happy enough to go and say to these guys, who are you? Are you God?" And it's
Yeah.
kind of funny because he can expect any old thing. You know, he's obviously somebody whose mind is open to all sorts of things.
Yeah, and living in a forest, can you imagine in
Yes,
these,
yes,
living right in a forest, you'll see and experience things that other
yes.
people would be fearful of. But I do love the merry-go-round that he goes with the,
Yes.
the night. Lorena, can you share with us about? Apologies, I'm going to take down this. Lorena, can you share with us about this image? Because we heard Sophie talking before about how important this meeting was, you know, where Percival first experiences a night, and how you brought this alive. You know, it's such an important image for this story. Can you share with us how this vision came to be?
Well, I couldn't resist showing that first moment where he sees these glowing knights. I love how bold he is, despite being completely in awe of these these godlike creatures that he that he sees. So so I work with silhouette, and usually it's a black silhouette, and I invert all these to white so that they're they've got that lightness, and expresses that kind of shining sense of awe that he has about them. And I made them slightly transparent as well, so that they all kind of merge together into this one kind of like, as you can imagine, it would have been completely overwhelming, him seeing these group of knights coming towards him, and the rainbow that frames them was kind of accidental, really. It was sort of just not quite coming together, and didn't quite have that perfect sense of awe that I wanted. And while I was working on it, we just happened to have a storm. As so often happens, I'll be staring at a file thinking, I really need something else, and that something else appears, a particular bird out the window, or a rainbow in the sky. So I raced out with the camera and I photographed the rainbow and slapped it in over Photoshop, and it framed them perfectly, and tied the whole thing together. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Now, I was just going to say, as soon as I saw this image, I thought, oh my God, Lorena's captured it exactly. It's that mix of magic and groundedness that you find in the stories too. It's like this kind of thing. It's another world, and yet it's firmly tied to this world too. It's really interesting how you manage straight away to capture that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I often think about how to portray that other world, because we work with fairy tales and folk tales so much. It's a world of the imagination, but the stories themselves are grounded in reality and come from everyday life. And because I work with photography, it's that perfect way to keep it grounded, keep it real, I suppose, but kind of hover around that veil between reality and something else. But I was actually going to ask you, Sophie, you were talking before about how you have a very strong image in your mind while you're writing the story, and then some illustrator comes along, makes up an image without even consulting you about what you see. How often do you sort of go, well, that's not how it looks, that's not how it's supposed to be, or is it delightful and surprising?
Yeah, it's a delightful surprise to me. And because what happens is let's say I have a strong image. It's like an image of an atmosphere, of a very strong atmosphere. I don't have specific, like, I don't know what people look like necessarily, even though, in these stories, because they're retelling, I know what Chrétien describes, but I don't have specific things. So I trust to the genius of the illustrator to actually be able to visualize that world. And I can't say that there's been a single time when I've been disappointed. Like, it's been, I think, oh my God, like I was saying, when I saw it, I thought, oh my God, you've got that, captured that exactly, the feel that's in this story. And it's because, the atmosphere to me is very visual, is very strong, but it's like, it's hard to explain, but it's like I can see a kind of world, but I don't see all the details of it. And so, I see the image, I think that's it. That's what it ought to be. That's what the specific is. No, yeah,
Right. Well, that's the good thing I think about working with silhouettes as well, is that you
yeah,
can show this image and you can show a lot of character and drama
yeah.
and atmosphere and everything that's happening, but it still leaves space for the imagination. It lets
That's
people
right.
um, use their own internal vision, I suppose, to give extra life to the characters.
Yeah,
I like that ambiguity about the silhouette, because it's sort of, when, like I say, when you're reading, you picture something, but you never, you have this idea of them, but you don't picture the exact faces, whatever. And and the silhouette, I think, really gives you that chance to overlay your own memories and experiences and imagination over what you see. It's sort of that extra layer of experience, I think, in
I think
reading.
for you as well, Lorena, is it unfolds for you as you start with the vision, inspiration, and then it just unfolds, doesn't it? It layers up and all of this, and then within you what and you have such a good connection with the author that you're able to bring it. I can't even imagine a time where you don't hit the mark. I know that you would know, but from
Quite a
my
few
personal
rejects
experience,
a few things that nobody gets to see.
but that's you reflecting it. That's
About
the
those.
thing. It's funny. Right, let's move on to our favorite illustrations now that we're talking about artwork. Sophie, what's your favorite illustration in the book?
so my favorite, well, I
Yes,
love the one of Percival and the Knights in the Wood.
yes.
But I will look, I'll just grab another one,
I'm just going to
which
sneaky peek.
is, so it's right at the end. And in fact, right at the end where we've got this little mock bestiary. And
What page is it?
that one, that's right. Yes, it's, yeah, the one on the right there. So I just think that is so magical because really conjures up the Middle Ages, and because they'd love doing things, with mille fleurs, lot of flowers, thousand flowers thing, but also the unicorn and the deer, and especially the white unicorn, white deer, which are very, very classic motifs in medieval legend. So I just love it because it just conjures up that whole atmosphere of the Middle Ages, of the 12th century, and I just amazed at how Lorena conjured it up. And the other one, sorry, I'm going to be greedy and suggest another one, which is on page 125, Karen,
Let me
and
see if
it's
I can find it.
magnificent peacock cloak, which is given to a young knight by the rulers of the Fairy Queen of Avalon. So it's magnificent as well. And it also has that quality of magical and yet grounded sort of feel to it.
So gorgeous, so gorgeous. Phenomenal. I love peacocks. It's a thing. I just love them. Lorena, can I just ask how many elements are in this image? And I love this image. If the cover we chose wasn't it, I think this would have been. This is a beautiful cover illustration.
I was going to go back and count how many flowers I put in there before we started speaking, but from memory, it was around 286.
Is that a record? Is that a record for you?
Yeah, very nearly, yeah. I've got one I've done more recently that has exactly 300 in it. But yeah, so these flowers, I think it was Christmas the year before last. We were spending it with my mum in Bendigo, and I spent a good part of the day crawling around her garden with the camera, photographing as many flowers as I could, and bits of leaves and various things, and came back and did the same at home. And so a couple of years before, I'm just trying to think when it was. It was a few years ago when I was doing school tours with Kate Forsyth for one of our previous books. I went up there a day early so that I could go to the National Gallery up there and go and see the unicorn tapestries because they were on display at the time. So I spent a very happy hour in a dark room looking at the at the tapestries there, and kept thinking how amazing it would be to try and recreate it. So this gave me the chance to. So I spent a couple of days, I think, layering flowers and killing my lower back, staring at Photoshop.
You're so tall, Lorena. Like, you are so tall as well. You know, I often talk about, you know, in Ireland when we went to the castle, finding you lying in a ditch or something. You know, I don't, you know what I mean? It's
You're not
phenomenal.
the first person to find me lying in a ditch, but it's for a good purpose.
You're dedicated to it.
Always for a good purpose.
But you see the vision and you go after because you know it's going to be part of something bigger afterwards. And whenever you go, oh, I know what that's for now. It's beautiful. But this illustration is beautiful and exquisite. And each one has a story, doesn't it? For each element in the illustration, there's a story behind each one.
Yeah, that's right.
I love it.
Yeah, they're all beautiful. It's very hard to choose. I love them all.
It is. And something special in this book that you generously brought in, ladies, is this extras bit with the exciting discovery of the Arthurian bestiary, or sorry, I sabotaged that. Who wants to say that?
Bestiary, bestiary.
There you go.
Yeah.
Beautiful. And it is just extras, beautiful visuals, and this illustrations in there, and it just gives a greater understanding and more depth to understanding the book as well. So I absolutely adore it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And yes, so congratulations to you both on this another beautiful collection in this kind of series. I like to, because they're all French fairy tales brought together. But just finally, how is the magical tales of French Camelot different to French fairy tales, Sophie?
Well, it's different because the aside in the French fairy tales, so two of the stories are told by originally told by named authors who were Charles Perrault in the case of Puss in Boots and Madame le Prince de Beaumont in the case of Beauty and the Beast. But the others are from anonymous, folk tales. They're different because they're less. I guess they have. They're each of them their own little world, and it forms a whole body of fairy tales. But the tales, the Arthurian tales, form an enormous saga that actually has been going for centuries and is still going. Still, people writing Arthurian novels and so on today. So it's part of an enormous world, which is part of the heritage of the whole. Well, I mean, French fairy tales are part of the heritage of the world as well as of France, of course. But these are sort of like, it's a thing that people have felt that they can write into because, from the start, from these 12th century stories, which is really where the literary part of King Arthur begins. Those people chose to adapt the story how they wanted. So, Chrétien has a thing about, sometimes Arthur, the court of Arthur is in Camelot, which is his invention, but sometimes it's in a place called Cargwint, which is a real place in Wales, but which bears no resemblance to Wales really, because for him and for other people of that time, those countries, the Celtic countries in particular, and particularly Wales and Brittany, were kind of almost like imagination worlds where you draw things. So Marie herself said, this is a tale I heard from the Bretons. And when she talks about Bretons, she means both the Bretons from Brittany and the Bretons from Great Britain, which is in France, it's the same word, So she says that because everyone knew that when you said that, oh my God, you're going to get this fantastic story, which has got magic, which has got knights, which has got love, which has got all this stuff, So it's part of a huge literary movement, I think, in a way that the fairy tales were, in a sense, but they came out of an anonymous folk tradition. The Arthurian stories were built up from these literary works, really. So I guess that's the difference. Yeah.
Amazing. And we're all very familiar, aren't we, with, that era. And, there's lots of stories about it. There's films and all of this that portray it in different ways and different, visuals. And in your book, it just brings us to to understand it in a more magical way because of what the essence of the book. Beautiful. Lorena, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I was just thinking how much fun it was to actually work with some Arthurian tales, because I read a lot of them as a child, but of course from the English tradition. I've got a collection somewhere of 3 of the romance tales, which were very much knights racing off and saving princesses and doing knightly things. But I always really loved them, and had always kind of thought I'd really love to get the chance to really delve into those stories and that sort of medieval tradition. And it was great to get the chance to, and especially great to get the chance to with Sophie as well. So
these two are magical together. That's why, and it just comes true in the book. Absolutely. Beautiful, gorgeous book. Guys, we have a beautiful shipment that came in, hence why we're doing our gorgeous interview today. In celebration of Global Folklore Day, World Folklore Day tomorrow, which is on August 22nd. So we're celebrating in style. So pop on over to serenitypress.org and check out our Serenity Folklore collection, where you'll find both magical tales, French Camelot and French fairy tales, and all of these other amazing titles, and celebrate World Folklore Day in style, because these tales are filled with wisdom and knowledge, and they're really entertaining. And I know that my daughter, who has recently read this, is 13, and she absolutely adored this book. So so you captured the market. I always gauge them on her. She loves them. So thank you, ladies, for showing up and bringing this beautiful collection together. And will there be a third?
Well, we never know. We might be plotting and planning. We'll
Brewing. I always have to ask. I always do. There's magic in 3. That's right.
Yes, that's true.
Thank you both. Thank you both. Is there anything you want to say to anybody before we go?
No, well, just to thank you, Karen, for believing in this book and in French fairy tales as well, and for doing such a beautiful production. So and we hope that readers will love it.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's so lovely to have it out in the world. We're looking forward to hearing back from people.
It is special. Guys, get it. Come and tell us what you think about it. Take your selfies with it. Go to your local bookstore and ask for it, because it's available to them. And, help us get the word out about it, because that's how these stories get shared, is through dialogue, really, isn't it? There wasn't social media back in the 12th century. And yet these stories made their way into the 21st.
I'm sure they had some pigeons too.
Yes, that's right. I think they would have loved it. The whole atmosphere of the time, you just feel they were really into all sorts of stuff, and into new things, and into lots of there was lots of trends and things like that, and it was really very much a young person's society too, of course. So they were really. I'm sure that if they saw it, they'd get into it in no time.
Be TikToking all around the place. Amazing. Thank you to everyone who has joined us. We had Kez and John Kelly and Jane Carlisle, and Jill says it's interesting World Folklore Day. There you go. So it's really fascinating and wonderful to know that, and to celebrate it is amazing. So thank you everyone for watching, and thank you to Sophie and Lorena for joining me. Bye guys. Get over to serenitypress.org and get your
Bye. Thank you.